Chapter 11. The Second Round. Jen wasn't even sure why she did it. Possibilities rolled over again and again in her mind. She knew how important it was to find the other bearers of the soul, and to recruit as many of them as possible to the cause of fighting the Soul Takers. She knew that all of the bearers were in equal danger, and that coming together was their best chance for survival. Yet, at the same time, she feared for the safety of her sister. She kicked herself for failing to foresee this possibility. So many of the fragments had been reborn into members of the same family, so it made sense that Jen's sister might be a bearer as well. Logic dictated that Chris would be safer if she was brought into the fold where everyone could look out for her once the final battle started. And yet Jen made the snap decision in that moment to fly in the face of logic. She didn't want her sister to risk herself in such a dangerous fight if it wasn't absolutely necessary, and so she would shield her sister from the truth and the associated danger completely. Jen tried to rationalize her decision. Maybe the ring was acting up. Objects imbued with soul were said to be finicky near the end of their shelf life. Maybe these rings were older than Karen and the others thought. It was also possible that the ring had still been reacting to Rocky's special soul. And to distract herself from second-guessing that conclusion, she rededicated herself to fighting in the tournament for as long as she could. Jen looked around the room, and her eyes fell upon the thin-framed kid with the dark hair, Ray. He'd won his first round match, so he would be her opponent in the second round. It only made sense that all the second round fights would be fought at the same time, which meant that Jen would very likely be fighting again immediately. Sure enough, Jack announced that the second round was about to begin. Tucker stepped up next to Jen. "Well, even if I couldn't beat that Rocky guy myself, I did wear him out. Maybe your sister will be able to finish what I started." Jen watched Chris step up across from Rocky. As she did, Ray made his way to one of the unoccupied mats. Jen pulled the little ring out of her pocket again. It had stopped glowing. She handed the ring to Tucker. "Sarah needs this next. Give it to her, will you?" She didn't wait for his response, moving immediately to face down her opponent. Ray sized Jen up with a frown. "You beat Nate pretty easily, huh?" "I did," Jen agreed. "But it's really his own fault. Nate's one of the strongest guys who trains here," Ray explained. "Jackson decided to host this tournament to build friendships with other dojos in the area, but that's what Jackson wants. It's not what I want. I don't like the idea of a bunch of people coming into my house and showing up my friends. That's why I'm going to knock you out of this tournament right now." Jen frowned. Now she understood why this guy had been projecting such a negative attitude since she'd walked through the door. She understood where he was coming from, too. She could only imagine how she would feel in his place. But that didn't mean that she was going to roll over and let herself lose. Energy built in the air between herself and her opponent. Wanting to end this fight as quickly as possible, Jen actually made the first move this time. As soon as Jack announced the start of the match, she sent Soul down into her hands, and an orb of soft purple light sprang into existence in each of them. Jen wound up, and she threw both orbs at her opponent. She expected him to weave between them, giving her an early look at how he moved, but instead he raised his hands and sent bolts of soul out into the area that was charged by the clashing energies of the two fighters. That soul pooled instantly in multiple points in the air, and with a mere gesture, pulses of soul shot forth from those little pools of energy and blasted Jen's attacks mid-air with pinpoint accuracy, canceling them out. Ray gestured again, and the floating pools of soul spread out, hovering in the air all around his opponent. With a smirk, he snapped his fingers, and more of those pinpoint blasts shot from each of them in turn, this time aiming for Jen herself. She reacted instantly, wrapping herself in soft purple light, decreasing the effects of gravity on her own body. She twisted in place, avoiding the first two blasts by the skin of her teeth, and then she leapt forward and rolled, avoiding the next. She avoided another and another, but the blasts just kept coming. Ray timed them so that each time Jen found an opening that might get her to him, she was diverted back instead. She wasn't given a moment's reprieve either. Every single one of the blasts was too precise. Ray wasn't simply firing them randomly, and so Jen couldn't assume that any of them would miss. She didn't have the strength to deflect the blasts without taking damage from them anyway, so she kept avoiding them, pushing her speed and her agility to their limits. She could feel beads of sweat running into her eyes, and yet she couldn't even spare a moment to wipe them away. Jen was, however, more than capable of thinking on the fly. She trusted her body to move how she needed it to, putting her mind to work searching for solutions. So far, Ray hadn't had to renew his attack by sending more soul into the air to refill those little pools. He should have expended them by now, running them dry, and yet he was continuing to fire, and the blasts were coming faster and faster. With no clue as to when the blasts would let up, or even how they were still coming, Jen had to send more and more soul out into her limbs to boost her speed even further just to keep ahead of them. With no pause in the action where she could slow down and generate more, it was only a matter of time before her current well dried up and she wasn't able to continue. That's when it hit her what was happening, how her opponent was able to keep attacking without sending more of his soul out into the environment. The secret was remembering the nature of the current heart-to-heart and what it was part of. After all, Ray's soul wasn't the only soul in that room. Jen realized suddenly that Ray's attack could only be drawing the soul that it required from her, at least indirectly. Ray had made his attack part of the environment, able to draw from the environment itself, from the energy generated by the clash of the two fighters' souls, the same energy that charged the air with static. There was more to it, though. Even then, it shouldn't have been possible for Ray to keep the attack going for so long, but this wasn't a normal situation. 3 other heart-to-hearts were happening all around them in relatively close quarters, charging the air with the energies of those fighters as well. Jen was effectively pitting her soul against the soul of 3 people. Unfortunately, knowing this didn't give Jen any kind of edge. She had no idea how she could use this information, or even if she could use it at all. Exhausted, she finally took a hit. One of Ray's blasts clipped her leg mid-flip, and she was sent tumbling to the ground. Before she could react, another 3 blasts hit her in the back and shoulder. They weren't concentrated enough to do any real physical damage through the soul that protected her body, but that didn't make the experience any less painful, and each hit still expended some of that soul and drained her strength. Jen writhed, and Ray gestured once again, repositioning the little pools and preparing for a more focused finishing barrage. "So," Ray asked confidently, "are you ready to give up yet?" Still in pain, Jen fought her way back to her feet, clutching her injured shoulder, and said, "That's the thing about me, and my whole family, really. We don't give up no matter what. It's honestly kind of annoying sometimes." Ray smirked. "All right then, we'll do this the hard way." He crossed his arms over his chest and snapped his fingers again. The floating pools of energy glowed menacingly. Jen had less than a second before they would fire a finishing technique. Well, Jen thought, I did come here today to test my new techniques. Couldn't hurt to perform the first test now. She reached into her pocket and removed a 4-inch cylinder of wood, roughly 2 inches in diameter. As the barrage of blasts began to rain down on her again, Jen channeled as much soul as she could still muster up into that piece of wood as she turned on her heels. The piece of wood glowed with soft purple and golden light, and it grew suddenly to the length of a typical quarterstaff. Jen twirled it expertly as she spun around, deflecting the blasts as quickly as they could reach her. Her defense finally culminated in her batting one of the blasts back at Ray himself. Finally, he was forced to move, shifting to the side to avoid injuring himself. Surprised, Ray let up on his attack. He looked Jen up and down, confused. "Where did you get a weapon from?" he asked. "I saw enough of your last fight to see that you have gravity powers, not the power to manifest weapons." "That's not entirely right," Jen explained, happy for any respite she could find. "My soul actually gives me power to manipulate many of the forces of the earth, including nature itself. I just find the ability to control gravity to be more useful in the majority of situations, so I focused on developing that ability above any others." She held her new staff out in front of her. "This is an example of a deviation from that strategy. In preparation for this tournament, I cut a small piece of wood from a tree and imbued it with my own life energy, keeping it alive. By adding some of my soul to the life energy in the wood, I can magnify that life energy and make the wood grow longer at will, and saturating it with soul makes it stronger than regular wood, surpassing even steel." She smirked at her opponent. "I may not be strong enough to deflect your blasts with my bare hands without being hurt, but this staff is at least as durable as I am, and hitting it doesn't deplete my strength. Your attacks can't reach me anymore." Ray scowled. "We'll see about that." He gestured again, and the floating pools of soul began shifting position at random each time they fired. The blasts were less predictable now, but they came more slowly. Jen turned in place and twirled her staff with precision, knocking the blasts away again and again as she inched her way closer and closer to her opponent. She could tell when he began to panic, directing his blast to fire faster and faster, but by now it was too late. Jen stopped deflecting the blasts, taking a page out of Tucker's book and allowing herself to take a few hits, but giving her an opening to counterattack. She aimed the tip of her staff at her opponent and willed more soul into it. It grew longer just as suddenly as before, slamming Ray in the chest. In the same moment, Jen willed the soul enveloping her to reverse its pull, weighing her down instead of making her lighter, anchoring her in place. Ray, who had never moved far from the edge of the mat where he had started the fight, was pushed out of bounds easily. All but the original 4 inches of Jen's staff broke away and withered to dust. The soft purple light that wrapped around her body faded away, as did the little pools of energy that were all that was left of Ray's attack. Jen smiled at her latest success, even as she collapsed heavily to one knee, her supply of soul almost completely depleted. With a great deal of effort, she wrestled herself to her feet and willed what soul she had left to mix with her life energy. That life energy flared and she wrapped herself in it, creating a shimmering golden life energy aura. She felt an immediate sense of relief as her injuries began to heal and her fatigue melted away. Ray glared at Jen. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he restrained himself and walked away to stand with some of his fellow students, talking quietly with them. Jen could have gone over to them and made an attempt to smooth things over, but she decided that she couldn't be bothered with him and his little grudge. Instead, she turned her attention toward the other fights still happening around her. Chris had already lost her heart-to-heart to Rocky, who didn't seem much worse off than he had been before the match had started. Meanwhile, Monty had defeated his opponent as well, which just left Sarah's fight against the final person of interest. Mina might have looked similar to Jen in style, but she couldn't have been more different in terms of her tactics, lunging at Sarah and then retreating away again and again rapidly, attacking multiple times with each advance. Her hands were wrapped in golden energy that extended past the tips of her fingers in the shape of a beam sword. Jen recognized this fighting style. Mina had a light soul, a subtype of natural soul, which didn't harm the body of its target hardly at all, but stripped away the opponent's soul with each hit. Like many fighters with this type of ability, Mina had learned to shape her soul into a weapon so she could cut away at her opponent's soul as efficiently as possible. Her sword wasn't just for show, either. As she darted acrobatically around her opponent, it was clear that she knew how to use it. Despite her small frame and quick, dance-like movements, Sarah was barely able to avoid her opponent's attacks. It reminded Jen of her own situation only a few minutes ago, pushed so hard that she was effectively backed into a corner. Jen had no way of knowing how many hits Sarah had already taken, but it didn't look like she was going to be able to keep going for much longer. In fact, as soon as Jen started watching, Sarah stumbled. She only lost her footing for a fraction of a second, but it was enough of an opening for her opponent to slash her solidly across the chest with her energy blade. Sarah was knocked back, and Mina pressed her advantage, surging forward and zipping around her opponent in a seemingly random pattern, attacking again and again from multiple directions. Jen could feel her cousin's soul fading with each hit. Soon she wouldn't be able to fight back, and Mina would win by attrition. Mina drew back and raised her blade high, energy crackling down her arms, feeding more of her light soul into her weapon. It grew larger as it was saturated with power. Mina brought it down, meaning to slash Sarah across her entire torso, stripping her remaining soul away and burning her out. Desperately, Sarah sent soul into her hand, giving it a cool blue glow, and she reached out, catching the energy blade and holding it in place. Mina was so surprised that even though she could have just dissipated the sword and created it again, the thought didn't seem to cross her mind until it was too late. Meanwhile, Sarah's soul was still drained from her body through the point of contact between Mina's blade and her hand, but she had at least saved herself from losing all of her soul at once, buying herself time to send more of that dwindling soul out into the air around her. Moisture in the air, everything from water vapor to sweat to blood shed by the tournament fighters, coalesced and pooled in the air just next to Sarah's hand. She grabbed that water, and it stretched and condensed even further, solidifying into a roughly sword-shaped length of super-dense, soul-charged ice. Sarah swung it in an upward arc, knocking Mina's sword up and away, opening Mina's torso to attack. Sarah lunged forward and drove the butt of her newly formed weapon into her opponent's chest. Then she turned in place, jumped, and spin-kicked Mina in the stomach, causing her to stumble several feet. Sarah held her icy sword close to her body, and it flashed with blue light. Meanwhile, Mina recovered her footing and sent more soul into her own blade, and it began to crackle with static energy. The two girls swung their blades at the same time, slinging waves of soul from the edges of those blades towards their respective opponents. At the same time, each of them banked to the side. Sarah successfully dodged Mina's attack, but whether by luck or by skill, Sarah's attack didn't miss. Mina was sent sprawling, and Jack rushed over to begin the count. Mina managed to push herself up by the count of 5, but when she did, Sarah reached down and touched the floor. "Life," she declared, "from the earth." She was wrapped in a soft golden glow, her injuries healing and her soul skyrocketing in an instant, setting her hair and clothes aflutter in a vortex of renewed power. "Yeah, okay," Mina said flatly, raising her hands submissively, and she walked out of bounds of her own accord. Sarah allowed the extra energy that she had generated with life from the earth to dissipate. She looked a little annoyed that the fight had ended so abruptly, but because she hadn't had to use the majority of the energy she'd gathered, she was able to send it back into the earth, making the technique available again immediately. She walked over next to Jen, removing the ring necklace from around her neck. "That girl was tough," she explained, "but this thing didn't glow once during the entire fight." "That's everyone of interest, then," said Lawrence, walking over along with Monty and Tucker to join them. "We can leave this dump and get on with our lives." "Not yet," Jen argued. "We still haven't set a time to talk with Rocky." "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "Plus, Jen and I are supposed to fight in the next round. And you," she gestured at Monty, "are supposed to fight Rocky. Aren't you curious to see how strong he is for yourself? Maybe a bit, Monty admitted. Lawrence rolled his eyes at him. Then that settles it, Sarah announced, making the final decision for everyone, as she often tended to do. We're staying and we're finishing this tournament. You realize, Monty told Jen and Sarah, smiling cheekily, that if we stay and continue, one of you might very well have to fight me in the final round. Jen and Sarah traded looks and smiled excitedly. Monty had been their enemy until very recently, but he was still a strong opponent, and now that they were allies, testing themselves against him was a welcome challenge. They looked at Monty again, and Sarah said, with as much confidence as she could force into her words, Yeah, well, then bring it on.